everybody! I am Lizzy Bean, the founder of Stitch People, and I'm going to teach you how to cross-stitch. But first, what is cross-stitching? Cross-stitching. Cross-stitching? What is Stitch People? Who's Lizzy Bean? Well, I'm Lizzy Bean. Allow me to answer your questions 3. I'm just a human female who started a company called Stitch People, where we create custom cross-stitch family portraits and custom cross-stitch family portrait patterns. We'll get into that more a little bit later. Third, cross-stitching is a wonderful craft. It's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Talk about a history. Cross-stitching is a type of craft, just like scrapbooking or sewing, quilting, knitting, crocheting, painting, or beading. And it's a type of embroidery that you do with a needle and thread, or in this case, embroidery floss. Now, the cross stitch is just one of many different types of embroidery stitches. It consists of 2 diagonal stitches overlapping, and you repeat those over and over again, like the pixels that make up an image on your computer, to create a beautiful work of art. That's what cross stitching is. And just by creating X after X after X and changing the colors, you can create wonderful, wonderful pieces to gift to your friends and family, hang on your own wall. Whatever you can dream up, you can probably do it with cross-stitching. Now, before we jump right into cross-stitching, you're gonna have to have a few materials on hand. Bummer, I know, you can't just poof it out of thin air. Luckily, most of these materials are really easy to find at any local craft store or even craft stores online that can be shipped directly to your house. First, you're gonna need fabric. Cross-stitching uses a very specific fabric called Aida fabric. That's A-I-D-A. Or, if you're a fan of the Elton John musical, Aida. Just kidding. Aida fabric has a very special weave to it that makes it perfect for cross-stitching. The way it's woven together creates a grid that leaves some holes in the fabric that kind of act as the anchor points in the 4 square corners that you need to create your cross-stitch. Here's something interesting. Aida fabric comes in different sizes. This little baby is a size 14 Aida fabric. Pro tip! You can tell because it says 14 count. What that means is there are 14 squares in the Aida fabric to an inch. You'll also see size 11, which actually means a bigger weave because there's 11 squares to the 1 inch versus 14. There's also 18, which is very common, and there's also 28, which is super fun because that is just twice as small as the size 14. So your stitches actually remain the same size. It's just that visually, the holes all look a little bit smaller, and it looks like you're stitching on more of a linen than a traditional Aida fabric. Pro tip! Next, you're gonna need a needle, or many needles, if you are like me and you lose them frequently and then inadvertently step on them with your bare feet in the rug. There are many different types of needles. I like to use traditional embroidery needles. These are needles that taper to a sharp point at the end. They make it very easy to poke through the fabric. Poke. There's also something called a tapestry needle, which is traditionally used for cross-stitching. A tapestry needle isn't pointy on the end, so it's not going to draw blood from your finger, like I have done many times. Ouch. Do not recommend. But a tapestry needle is blunt at the end. And that's good for cross-stitching because the Aida fabric, which has the holes already woven into it, doesn't require a sharp point to poke through that fabric. However, with Stitch People specifically, I like to have a little more freedom, so I usually use an embroidery needle. Next, you're going to want an embroidery hoop or embroidery frame of some kind to hold your fabric tight while you work. And these come in all different shapes and sizes: square, oval, bamboo, wood, cherry, vanilla, grape, diet. Just kidding, those are soda flavors. You're gonna want an embroidery hoop. Trust me, it makes life way easier. So you've got your fabric, you've got your needle, you've got your hoop. Now you're gonna need some embroidery floss to use to create your projects. Again, embroidery floss is the type of thread that is used for cross-stitching. It's awesome! Embroidery floss comes in hundreds of different colors. You could not dream of a color that does not exist in embroidery floss. It comes in so many different colors and types. You can get cool glitter floss, you can get cool metallic floss. I'm telling you, it's a fun time. It's a fun time, I'm having so much fun with my floss. A quick note about embroidery floss. I'd like to point out that embroidery floss is actually made up of 6 separate threads twisted into one. So that actually offers you quite a lot of versatility in your projects. If you want something to look really thin and delicate, you can just use just one of the threads. But if you want to make it look a little thicker, you can use two threads. You could use 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. I mean, that's where you stop because it comes with 6 strands. I mean, I guess you could double it over and use 12, but just that's something I wanted to point out. There are a couple other tools that aren't specific to cross stitch, but that are pretty necessary and handy to have on hand when you're working on a cross stitch project. Those are a pair of scissors. You can use something just normal, regular scissors, or you can use a pair of teeny tiny itty bitty beautiful embroidery scissors if you want to feel very fancy. You'll also want to have a pen or pencil on hand, and you're gonna need a pattern to work from, but we'll get into that later. So, remember what I said earlier about cross stitch just being repeated X shapes over and over and over again. It's 2 overlapping diagonals that make a cross stitch. When you begin cross stitching, you'll use embroidery floss. Remember, that's 6 strands of thread that are twisted together to make the floss itself. Depending on what size of Aida fabric you're using, you're going to need to divide that floss. For example, on size 14 Aida fabric, you can use 2 or 3 strands depending on the look you like. I prefer 3, some people prefer 2. There's no right or wrong way. It's just kind of a matter of preference and what you like. So, for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to use this giant plastic canvas, this giant needle, and this yarn to show you how to get started cross-stitching. One thing to note with cross-stitching is we don't use knots. We thread our needle, and you leave a tail that you hold at the base of the needle. Now start poking through the fabric. Don't let your tail pull through. Hold that with your hand on the back, and you create a diagonal stitch, kitty corner, to where you just pulled your needle through. Pull that through to create a diagonal. Then, on one of the remaining 4 corners of your stitch, you bring your needle up, pull it through, and you'll see on the back side, you're creating a loop. And you want to take the loose tail of your floss and secure it in the loop of your floss that you're creating as you create this cross stitch, or in this case, the yarn, so that as you pull, that tail is secured to your project. Then we flip back to the front, finish the diagonal, pull it through, and that is how to create a cross stitch. And then you repeat these steps stitch after stitch. So if we go again to create a diagonal, we come up from the back, and this is one thing you want to avoid, is you don't want to come up through the existing floss. You want to come up next to it. That'll help keep your project clean. This is tricky to do with yarn. On the back, you can continue to secure the tail with the loops that your stitching is creating. And you finish off that cross stitch. And that's the basics of cross stitch. Now let's try it on regular Aida fabric using embroidery floss. Now, as you get going with a real-life cross stitch project, the amount of fabric you're going to need to cut will depend on the specific project that you're doing. For the sake of this example, I'm going to just cut enough fabric to fill my 7-inch hoop. In general, it's safe to plan on leaving an extra 2 inches of fabric space around the outer edge of whatever pattern it is you're working on. So I'm going to cut a piece of fabric that's about 9 inches square. Now, don't you know it, we're ready to go. So, once again, embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands. We're using size 14 Aida fabric, which means we'll want to use only 2 or 3 of the threads of this floss. I like to use 3. So, I'm going to divide my floss accordingly. You just kind of separate the strands with your fingers until you have as many as you need, and you just gently pull them apart. Sometimes this gets a little tangly. You just take it slow. Starting to get tangled. There we go. All right, now I have 3 strands to use, and I'm going to thread my needle. You got to get all 3 strands right through the eye of that needle. Remember, we do not pull it all the way through and create a knot. We leave a little tail and we hold it at the base of the needle to secure that floss in place. Now I'm going to show you the pattern I'm going to stitch. It's a heart. Now, since this is just a simple shape of one color, very simple pattern, not a lot of detail, you could put it wherever you want on your fabric. I'm going to put it smack dab in the middle. So for now, I'm just going to eyeball the center of my fabric. Before I put it in the hoop, I could have folded it in half both ways to define the center point. That's a tip for the future. Okay, I'm going to eyeball it from the top here. Ta-da! So now that I've roughly located the center of my fabric, I'm going to start at the bottom of the heart and make my first cross stitch. You bring your needle through from the back to the front. Remember, don't pull your floss through. Secure it with your finger. You're not going to need to make a knot. And you create your first diagonal using the hole that's kitty corner to where you started. Ta-da! Then, as you create the overlapping diagonal, you bring your needle through from back to front, flip your work over, and you use the loop that's being naturally created with your stitching to secure the tail of the floss. And now it holds on its own. And you finish your cross stitch. Then you work your way up to the next row. Now, when you have a row or a column of cross stitches, you get to decide if you want to complete each cross stitch individually, like this, under, over, under, over, under, over. Or you get to decide if you do all the unders and then all the overs, like this, under, 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 over, over, over. I'll show you. So you can create each cross stitch individually, like this. Create one diagonal, and then you create the next diagonal and finish the stitch. And you continue on like that until your row is complete, creating the under diagonal and then the over diagonal, and then the under diagonal and then the over diagonal. Or you can go like this. Under diagonal. There we go. Under diagonal. There we go. And you create all of the under diagonals at once. Then you create all of your over diagonals at once to complete your row. Ta-da! Fun fact! The method of creating one cross stitch at a time is called the English method, whereas creating all of the under diagonals and then all of the over diagonals is called the Danish method. Now here's the thing, there's no right or wrong way to cross stitch. Whether you complete one full stitch at a time or do rows and columns doing all the unders and then all the overs, it doesn't really matter. It's just up to you, your personal preference, how efficient they are for you, where you are in your project, what colors you're using, what the context is. It's really all subjective. So don't let anybody get you down for choosing one over the other. I personally usually use both methods multiple times in any given cross stitch project. So now let's finish stitching our heart. Yay! Record scratch! I just made a mistake. Sometimes when you're stitching, you overshoot one of the holes and you put your needle through the fabric, not utilizing one of the holes in the Aida fabric. That creates an inconsistent diagonal, and it's a really easy fix. My advice is you just retrace your steps and undo that stitch, put it back through the hole of the Aida fabric, and everything will be like it never even happened. So there's the hole in the Aida fabric. So I need to come up from where I came, undoing that stitch beautifully. I find the hole of the fabric and I fix that diagonal so it's even with the other diagonals. A fully completed cross-stitch project. Now, I know it's just a little heart, but the skills that you learn by doing just this one little shape will get you really, really far. Now, let me show you what to do when you've come to the end of a thread and you're either done with your project or you need to swap colors. If you look at the back of your cross-stitch project, you'll see the back side of all of your stitches. You'll see the tail that you had when you first started, which you secured using the loops of the cross-stitching. And you'll see the remaining floss that you have left. In order to secure this and keep it from pulling through or fraying your project, you just take your needle and the remaining floss that's still attached to it, and you slide it under the back side of some of these stitches, pulling your floss through and securing it so that it can't pop out. Then, using your scissors, you snip the ends and you are good to go. It's really as simple as that, and you can create magnificent masterpieces just by following patterns, putting stitches right where they need to go, and swapping out colors in the meantime. Now, one thing you may or may not know is that there are two types of cross-stitch. There's counted cross-stitch and printed cross-stitch. Printed cross-stitch is doing exactly what we just did, creating X stitches over printed patterns on top of fabric. It shows the cross stitches and you just trace it with your needle and floss. Now, counted cross stitch is only slightly more complicated. Basically, what it entails is viewing your Aida fabric as a graph. And then the printed pattern that you have, which is printed on a graph, translates directly onto the graph or grid that is your Aida fabric. You mark your center point by folding your fabric in half both ways, and you find your center point on your printed pattern. Then it's just a matter of counting up and over however many you need to put your cross stitches in exactly the right squares to get the pattern that's on the printed graph. Voila, easy as pie. Now I'd like to share with you a few tips for success to make sure that your cross stitch work looks like a total pro. So remember how each cross stitch is made up of an under diagonal and an over diagonal? Well, the number one tip for a professional looking cross stitch piece is to make sure that all of your under diagonals are going the same way across your entire project, and all of the over diagonals are going the same way across your entire project. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of alternating unders and overs, and it's going to make your piece look a little bit less consistent. Another tip is something we've already gone over, using the correct amount of strands from your embroidery floss for the size of Aida fabric that you're using. Another tip of the trade is keeping your tension consistent as you stitch. You don't want to pull your floss tight and bunch up your fabric as you go. Just keep a nice firm hold on your embroidery hoop and try and keep the tension of your stitches the same as you go. You'll be great. Another insider tip is to avoid going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth like this as you go. Stitching up and then stitching back and then stitching up and then stitching back and then stitching up. You're going to drive yourself crazy, and it's actually going to help with accuracy if you force yourself to try and keep an eye on the top or the front of your project as you go. Sometimes you need to look at the back, especially when you're securing your floss or trying to get it in just the right place. But if you can try and keep your focus on the top, you'll train your hand-eye coordination over time. It's totally worth it. And generally, it helps to get a more consistent look. There's another tip that I'm going to remind you of that we alluded to back when we were working on the plastic canvas with the yarn. While cross-stitching, you'll have a number of stitches sharing the holes in the Aida fabric. the corners of the cross stitches meet in the holes. So when you're pushing and pulling your needle through the hole of the Aida fabric, sometimes it's easy to catch the floss of an existing stitch. You want to avoid that. That's going to make your work look a little bit chunky and inconsistent. You want to make sure to slip the tip of your needle right next to the floss that already exists in the hole so that you don't get any bunching or pulling. Bunching and pulling is no fun at all. And this is a reason I actually like to use a pointed embroidery needle, is I find it's a little easier to poke that needle right next to the floss, and then there's no bunching, no catching, no pulling, no chunky, no yuck, just smooth. Ding! Now, this has just been the basics of cross stitch, teaching you what cross stitch is, how to do one, how to start one, how to end one. There's a lot of questions you're going to have as you get going. My biggest advice here is trust yourself and be creative. Try new things. See what works for you. Some people don't like to swap out their colors a lot, and they'll leave threads hanging and work with different colors at different times. I don't like to do that. I like to cut the ends of my floss as I go and rethread as I need to use colors again. Some people really focus on keeping the back of their work really, really neat. Some people don't mind, and the back of their work is really, really messy, but the front looks really good, which is the most important part. So don't get too in the weeds with your questions, with your concerns. Try it. Try something new and see what works for you. You will find a groove in no time, I promise. So now what? Where do you go from here? I'll tell ya, finger guns. If you want to practice your cross-stitch skills, search free cross-stitch pattern online and you will find plenty of things that you could use to hone your skills. Alternately, you could visit us at stitchpeople.com and learn how to create a Stitch People cross-stitch family portrait. Let me tell you more about it. With Stitch People, we empower you with tools, knowledge, patterns, techniques, you name it, to create your very own, totally unique, totally personal to you, custom cross-stitch family portrait. That's a tongue twister. Custom cross-stitch family portrait. Custom cross-stitch family portrait. Custom cross-stitch family portrait. Custom cross-stitch family portrait. Now that you know how to cross-stitch, you too can create your own personal cross-stitch family portraits to commemorate your favorite memories and moments in time. Weddings, anniversaries, birthdays, retirement gifts, family vacations, baby announcements. A Stitch People portrait is good for almost any occasion. And I gotta tell you, the people who get these as gifts love them. They are so personal, so detailed, so fun. It's a great way to channel your creative energy and your brand new cross-stitching skills. I sure hope you find this video helpful, and I hope you feel a little more confident in how to cross-stitch moving forward. Feel free to reach out with any questions. We will get back to you when we can. But in the meantime, I hope you feel empowered and creative and ready to put your new skill out there in the world. And congratulations, you just learned a centuries-old art form. How about that? Thank you so much for joining me. Again, I'm Lizzy Bean with Stitch People at stitchpeople.com. And here's the thing, I want to see what you create no matter what. Whether it's Stitch People or not, I don't even care. I want to see what you create as a result from learning to cross-stitch with me here today. So just use the hashtag StitchPeople so that we can see the beautiful work that you come up with. I want to celebrate with you. Yay you! You have a new skill and hopefully a new hobby, something that you enjoy for many, many years to come. Thanks so much. Have a great day.